Good morning and welcome to the 28th meeting of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee for 2019. I ask everyone to turn electrical devices to silent, and apologies have been received from committee member Richard Lyle, and John Mason is here in his stead. So welcome to John Mason coming back again to the committee. Now, the first item is item 1 on the agenda, which is for the committee to take items 4, 5 and 6 in private. Are we agreed? Thank you. And then item 2 on the agenda is consideration of 2 proposals by the Scottish Government to consent to the UK Government legislating using the powers under the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018 in relation to proposed UK statutory instruments. First, the recognition of professional qualifications, miscellaneous provisions, EU exit regulations 2019, which relate to the reciprocal framework of rules for the recognition of professional qualifications, enabling European Economic Area and Swiss nationals to gain access to the regulated profession in which they are qualified in another EEA state or Switzerland. And second, the recognition of professional qualifications, EFTA states, miscellaneous amendments, EU exit regulations 2019. The purpose of this instrument is to transpose the provisions of the EEA EFTA No Deal Citizens' Rights Agreement and Swiss Citizens' Rights Agreement, make minor changes to BEIS and DHSC regulations, and address infractions identified in normal business by the European Commission. Both regulations relate to regulations that were made on 19th February 2019, which amended existing legislation to ensure that a system of recognition of qualifications will continue to operate effectively if the UK leaves the EU without a deal. While the legislation is UK-wide, it applies to all regulated professions and intersects devolved matters relating to the regulation of teachers, lawyers, social workers, healthcare practitioners and others. The proposal will ensure that current recognition arrangements for these professions are maintained. Now, the notifications for these regulations suggest that they are all Category A proposals, that is to say, technical with minimum policy choice or only one obvious policy solution. Is the committee content for these matters to be dealt with by statutory instruments laid at Westminster? As the committee is content, I will write to the Cabinet Secretary to notify him of the committee's decision. We now come to item 3 on our agenda for today, to do with the energy statement. And the format of our session today is a roundtable, and we have a number of guests with us today. I would remind members to keep questions brief so we hear as much from our guests as we can. And if anyone wishes to come in, please raise their hand, or we'll see how the conversation simply flows. And there's no need to press any buttons or operate the microphones. That is done by the sound desk. So simply raise your hand if you want to come in, or as the discussion flows, as it were, that will be dealt with by the sound desk. Now, I would invite a brief introduction from witnesses and members, and I'll perhaps just start to my left with Dean Lockhart, and we'll just come right round the table. And I think if our guests could simply give us their name, the organisation they represent, and perhaps 1 or 2 very short sentences saying what that's about. All right, so I'll start with Committee Member Dean Lockhart.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everyone. Dean Lockhart, Member of the Scottish Parliament for Mid-Scotland and Fife.
Morning, everybody. Fabrice Lebec, Senior Policy Manager at Scottish Renewables. We are the trade association for renewable energy in Scotland, representing about 250 companies across the electricity and the heat sectors, ranging from utilities to developers right down to small installers and manufacturers. And our main interest today is the policy environment that supports the businesses that are actually actively doing low carbon heat today.
Colin Beattie, MSP for Midlothian, Northern Musselburgh.
Teresa Bray, I'm the Chief Executive of Changeworks. We're directly involved with the delivery of a whole range of programmes, both in fuel poverty and for the self-funded householders and small businesses on energy efficiency, working also with local authorities and housing associations to assist them in the delivery, including areas such as district heating as well.
Jamie Harper-Johnston, MSP for the Highlands and Islands.
Hi, Anthony Kyriakidis. I'm the Head of Renewables at the Energy Saving Trust. EST's Scotland and the UK's leading impartial organisation helping people save energy and reduce carbon emissions. And we do this by directly supporting consumers to help them take action by providing information and advice, as well as helping other bodies like local authorities and also community groups.
Andy Whiteman, MSP for Lothian.
John Mason, MSP for Glasgow Shettleston.
Janette, Webb, Edinburgh University. I lead a research group called Heat in the City. It is social research, not engineering or economic research. So we look particularly at the governance of innovation in relation to the future of heat systems in context of climate emergency. I'm also a infrastructure commissioner for Scotland with a particular remit for low carbon infrastructure.
Jackie Bailey, MSP for Dumbarton.
I'm Euan McVicar. I'm General Counsel at Ofgem. We are the GB-wide gas and electricity markets regulator, and our primary purpose is to promote the interests of present and future energy consumers.
Gordon MacDonald, MSP for Edinburgh Pentlands. I'm Keith Bell. I'm based at the University of Strathclyde, where I'm an energy system researcher. But I'm here today representing the Committee on Climate Change, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. And yeah, of course, you know, provide a statutory duty to provide advice to government and the devolved administrations, including here in Scotland. Net Zero report was, of course, published in May. Very pleased to see that it's now setting a strong agenda in terms of what we're trying to do policy-wise, and we'll be expecting to publish, I think, a progress report to the Scottish Parliament in probably next month, actually.
Hi, I'm Willie Coffey, MSP for Kilmarnock and Irvine Valley.
Hello, Elizabeth Leighton. I'm the Director of the Existing Homes Alliance, which is a coalition of housing, environment, fuel poverty, consumer, energy advice provider organisations, all working to argue for improvements in our existing housing stock to meet climate change and fuel poverty objectives.
Well, thank you very much, Devin. I'm Gordon Lyndhurst, MSP for Lothian and convener of the committee. So perhaps I might start with a couple of questions. And first of all, perhaps Professor Bell and Professor Webb, directed to you. Do we need a new target for non-electrical heat demand, or are the more recent climate change plan targets now sufficient? Would one of you like to? Perhaps Professor Bell is being offered up as the person to answer first on that.
So I think the CCC's view on the non-electrical heat demand target is that, I guess, while a potentially useful instrument does in practice seem to put a very strong focus on use of biomass, and in the longer term that's not necessarily the right approach. You know, there will be competitions for use of biomass. There are potentially other better ways of making use of it, for example in the construction sector. So, you know, the kind of the locking in of carbon through use of timber in construction of buildings. You know, use potentially as a fuel in the manufacture of hydrogen that should be accompanied then by carbon capture and storage, and so use at kind of like a smaller scale in buildings as a source of heat in the longer term, might not be really the best way of doing it. On the other hand, I think we'd say that the kinds of commitments on building standards and towards low carbon heating more generally, without necessarily driving it down a biomass route, are very useful. So the things in the Energy Efficient Scotland plan and it's outlined in the programme for government, we would see those as being generally a kind of good direction to take that, as I say, doesn't drive down a particular solution that might not be the best in the longer term.
Professor Webb?
Yes, I would argue that the target is challenging as it is at present, because we don't have any clear-cut solutions for non-electrical heat demand, and we know that the peak demand is very large comparative to electricity use, for example, and exactly how we solve that post-methane gas through the gas grid is still somewhat unknown. So I would argue it's more important to focus on amassing evidence in the next 5 years and developing some larger scale demonstrators than we have historically for alternatives such as gas hybrid heat pumps on the gas grid, and working significantly on the development of district heating infrastructure, which we've debated in Scotland for a considerable period now, but not got very far forward with, although it's recognised by the Committee on Climate Change as well as the Scottish Government as a no regrets solution whilst the future of the gas grid is in debate.
Thank you. And do you, other of our guests, wish to comment on this particular aspect of things? I mean, are our overall decarbonisation targets realisable? Are they realistic? Are they where they ought to be at? Fabrice Levesque.
So I think our position in terms of the 2030 target is that given that the overall climate change targets have got tougher, we need to align the 2030 target for heat, as well as the other sectors, with the new targets. So I think the existing targets means, as Jan says, a doubling of the rate of energy efficiency and low carbon heat deployment that we're currently doing. Even doubling would be difficult, but we have to first of all set a target that shows exactly what it is we need to do. I think targets are useful in terms of communicating to both industry and consumers what it is we have to set about doing. So I think as a priority, the upcoming climate change plan needs to clarify exactly what we're doing. And I agree with Professor Bell's point that we need a low carbon heat target that doesn't differentiate between electricity and non-electrical heat. We just need clarity, because the current target slightly confuses things around electrical heat and what's counted and what isn't.
Well, there's Anthony.
Yeah, just to support the points made, the target was set about 10 years ago, so obviously a lot's happened in the meantime. And as Fabrice was mentioning there, what does it actually mean in practice? With our work with consumers, it would be of benefit if there were targets that would be easier to spell out in numbers as to what it means for people. And the Committee on Climate Change have made some, they stated in their reports about, across GB, about there needing to be a million new heat pumps every year up until 2030. And that's a number you can start to get your head around. So in Scotland, maybe that's about 100,000 heat pumps every year, which is about 2,000 a week. So that's a number that feels like you can do something with. And being able to explain to the public about what's actually happening and the scale of challenge in those terms would be beneficial.
Do you know what the number of heat pumps being installed on a weekly basis in Scotland is at the minute?
Well, we know from the RHI the number of sort of domestic heat pumps that have gone in since, or have been accredited under domestic RHI since 2014. I think it's about 9,000 in Scotland. So we're talking about a scale of change of about, as a magnitude of difference. It's probably about, probably got some numbers here. There's about 9,000 heat pumps have been accredited under the domestic RHI. And so you'd need, so to go from that over a period of 5 years is a huge step change in the installation rate.
Elizabeth Leighton.
Yes, it's no surprise that for our organisation I would emphasise the importance of energy efficiency in achieving a heat demand or renewable heat target, because the more efficient we are, the more we reduce our heat demand, the less renewable heat we need. And so it may be useful to reference the targets in the climate change plan, which presumably will need to be reviewed and refreshed in light of the new climate change targets, which do give a figure for reducing heat demand from buildings, a separate target for domestic and non-domestic building. And I think that is equally important as the generation of renewable heat, is that we have an eye to looking at generation and supply side by side.
Thank you. Professor Bell, you would like to come back on one or two points?
Yeah, I think the targets, as we've said, are extremely important. They're setting a direction, setting visibility, helping, I mean, the industry actually, as well as homeowners, as an industry, a supply chain to deliver some of these changes, and building owners, including homeowners, those renting, social homeowners, non-domestic buildings as well. So the targets, of course, have to be backed up by action, to kind of implement what's there. And in terms of action, there's then some sort of prioritisation. As Anthony said, it's a big change, a difficult thing for people to get their heads around. It's a very high capital cost, especially in terms of heat pumps. So they're most effective if they're going into new buildings that are built to an appropriate, meaning very high, standard of insulation. So there's the opportunity to build up the supply chain and start to build up confidence in how these things work, and the fact that the construction sector knows what it's doing when it's installing it. So again, they have to be installed right, they have to be known to be right, and the obligation on new buildings to follow these standards starts to build that up. The retrofit is much harder, so maybe you could argue that, and it's a much bigger problem. There's many more buildings in that category. But if that can be followed up with a sector that's already kind of starting to get established, then maybe it's more deliverable.
Thanks. And Jackie Bailey.
Just a small point following on from that, because the Committee on Climate Change's advice was no new gas boilers installed from 2025. That's round the corner. So your idea of this plan, this route map, I'm wondering whether it actually exists. I'm wondering whether anybody's thought through the consequences for jobs, because there's a huge number of people employed in the gas sector, as we know, and I'm wondering about the interaction with fuel poverty. So, you've said this, it's easy to say. How easy is it to deliver against what Professor Webb said, which is we need 5 years of research? The two don't quite fit together. So, as a policymaker, I'm slightly confused.
Okay, it's a very fair question. The recommendation was made in specific to do with new homes. So I think a lot of the kind of scenarios for deployment of heat networks are out with that particular sector. The evidence I think that the CCC was considering seemed to be pretty strong. This combination of the new homes built to this kind of high standard. There's a higher upfront cost that somebody has to bear, and you're quite right about that. How that gets passed through in terms of the cost of the building and where that comes from, there's a big kind of variation in the cost of new homes anyway, something to do with the kind of value of the land and the kind of way the market goes. So that's something I'm personally not clear how that will develop, but you're right, there is an extra cost. Although relative to some standards that might be coming in further down the road that would oblige ripping out some gas boilers and replacing them with something before the end of their life, the cost is not that high. So this all has to be seen, I think, in the context of the general transition towards increasingly lower carbon emissions. As opposed to the jobs, and there are new jobs that will be created, of course, in terms of the skills and the expertise for installing correctly, and it's not a trivial task, the heat pumps and setting them up in the right way. So the opportunity for reskilling is something that has to be taken seriously, and that might need some investment. I think it's important that the industry takes on a large part of that cost. Now, how to oblige them to do it is a question I would put back to you policymakers. But there may well also be a role for government in terms of, FE colleges and so on. But it needs the commitment of also, there's individuals. So a lot of these home builders are, taking on contractors on a short-term basis. Do they have the right skills? Are they going to be certified in the right way? But actually, there's a responsibility then that's placed inevitably back on the individual workers. Are they able to get those contracts when you're bidding for work? So they in turn have to have confidence there is a market. Well, they're going to commit their own time to going and doing a course of an evening or a weekend to improve their skills. So all of this has to come together, I think. The market, along with the provision of the training, and then the certifications. We have to have confidence that they really know what they're doing. Getting involved in that, maybe it's a government intervention, but in terms of, and it's a cost, of course, it goes with it, about being able to ensure that the skills really are at the right level, and then that the builders are deploying them in the right way, and the buildings are really to the right standard. Not good enough to go into the kind of demonstration house on a new estate, and have a look at that one. There has to be some way in which the whole housing stock is sampled to give confidence that it's all done correctly.
Professor Webb, and then I think Fabrice Levesque wanted to come in as well. So, Professor Webb.
I was going to say I meant evidence, not research. I'm not asking for research funding, don't worry. No, I'm more concerned that, you know, as Keith's responses indicate, we are not clear yet about how we can decarbonise heat in our entire building stock, and we need to be clear very fast. So next 5 years, making those key decisions. I'm aware that, you know, the powers that we have in Scotland are not perhaps adequate to the purpose that we're setting ourselves here with the full decarbonisation of heat, because the major powers over energy are reserved to the Westminster Parliament. Now, you know, there is an argument for greater devolution of powers, for instance, in relation to regulation and taxation and licensing. But in the interim, we can nevertheless develop the kind of larger scale demonstrators that I was suggesting we need before, in order to examine, well, what works effectively in what sorts of areas, including low income areas, where I would argue, we should be socialising the costs of those upgrades fully, because there's a societal benefit, including in terms of jobs, welfare, as well as local economic regeneration. Places we've seen through the Energy Efficient Scotland pilots, which we're evaluating. We're doing the social evaluation. Energy Saving Trust does the technical evaluation of those pilots. One of the things we see is that when people are somewhat reluctant initially because they anticipate disruption from changes in insulation to their building, to their homes, and in the heating systems that they're using, is that if you can gain that kind of momentum locally through area-based schemes, then after the work gets done, apart from anything, the community can support each other. So on an area basis, people can be encouraged and supported to work together to move through that process. But also, people are pleased with the result. You know, in particular, for instance, something we hadn't really anticipated, the aesthetics afterwards of quotes from people saying, actually, the area looks great now. It looks like a place you want to be, you know, and being very positive about that. So we need to gather, I suppose that's my plea for evidence, to make sure that we're showcasing those examples and that this works and that it is a way to greater prosperity and skills. And I would agree with Keith that there are significant work opportunities here if we manage them well.
Thank you. We'll come to Fabrice Levesque and Theresa Bray, and then I think Colin Beattie wanted to come in as well. So first of all, Fabrice, and then Theresa.
Thank you. I agree with what's been said. I think in response to the question, obviously the heat industry is a large one. It's actually very varied as well. There are different sectors. So I might just quickly step through kind of the broad strategy that both the UK and Scottish governments are following, because I think discussions of this nature benefit from actually understanding the different sectors we're talking about. The electricity sector is a fairly homogenous one. The heat sector is actually comprised of different elements, which are all quite different, have different supply chains. And I think by going through that, we can kind of see where the opportunities are and where the challenges are in terms of existing workforce and future workforce. So very briefly, obviously, most buildings are connected to the gas network, about 80% of them. So that is the core of the problem. And the strategy there is obviously rolling out energy efficiency. That's a different supply chain. It's a small supply chain in Scotland, but arguably we have the best of the whole UK because we've held on to our fuel poverty alleviation schemes. So Changeworks that Theresa represents, they do a lot of really good work in that space. But that's really a supply chain that needs building. For other buildings on the gas network, the key priority in the near term is the rolling out of heat networks. Now, they would be in inner city areas, primarily serving large commercial buildings. Now, the majority of people who work in the gas industry, the majority of that workforce actually service individual households with gas boilers. So if we're rolling out heat networks in city centres, we're taking some work away from the guys who are installing large commercial gas boilers, but actually a lot of those firms also do low carbon heat. So actually there's quite a strong transition story there for the existing industry into doing heat networks. For everywhere else that we can't do heat networks that currently uses gas, we're probably looking at either electric heat pumps or perhaps hydrogen in the existing gas network. And I think that's where Professor Webb's point around demonstrators and more evidence is key, because that is a large proportion of buildings. And at this stage, we don't have an industry that's doing those technologies, and we need to invest in showing we can know how the solutions can be done and how we get the current workforce into those kind of jobs. The 20% of buildings that aren't on gas, they're primarily in rural Scotland, off the gas grid, and there, really the story is installing heat pumps, biomass. The existing supply chain there is primarily oil heating, so people who deliver oil out to those communities, a small amount of LPG as well. The UK government's already working on an engagement plan to advertise to that industry that off gas grid households, because heat costs are higher, because the CO2 emissions are higher, will be first to transition away. So again, there's quite a defined industry there, and you could see them transitioning into doing things like heat pumps and biomass, and it's already being thought about. I'd argue that the Scottish Government is a little bit lacking behind UK Government thinking there. And then finally, the last piece of the puzzle is new buildings. It's actually a small part of the overall picture, because we only build, say, 15,000 new homes a year in Scotland. That's the construction sector, and I think, again, because of the UK and Scottish Government announcements, they are now gearing up to switch from installing fossil fuel heating to low carbon alternatives. So again, there the challenge is less great, because it's been well advertised for at least a decade, and we frankly should have done it sooner to stop putting fossil fuel heating into new buildings and to do low carbon solutions. So that's a bit of a tour of the different sectors and kind of the job impacts.
Theresa Bray.
I think it's important that we bring it back to the context that we're living in a climate emergency, that we have the Committee on Climate Change came out that it is technically feasible for Scotland to be net zero by 2045, and that's been agreed with support from all political parties. To actually do that, though, is challenging, but it's going to require a change in the mindset of how we do it. It's going to have to need an increase in the urgency. There is often a very the culture that we have of a very long time developing policies, lots of consultation, a very risk-averse approach, the lack of actually support to make things happen actually it makes achieving that target much more challenging. But Scotland can do it. We have put so many things in place which, if we actually fully commit to it, we can follow through. Fabrice mentioned that a lot of the fuel poverty programmes which we've got, whether it's Warmer Home Scotland or the area-based schemes, and they are there, but there are things that they're not operating as effectively as possible. And it's not due to the lack of supply chain. The supply chain is there, whether it's in Warmer Home Scotland, which we haven't been able to promote nearly as widely as with. So there are a lot of your constituencies who would be eligible, because it's often you have to have both low energy efficiency and also on suitable benefits. They would be eligible if they knew about it. And there's a need for that further promotion. We've got area-based schemes where a lot of the local authorities, this again is working in fuel-poor areas, doing projects such as external wall insulation. They are there. The local authorities, though, struggle to deliver. And we have to think what extra support they did it. You have a poor procurement officer who isn't familiar with it, and yes, they work on their own stock, but are they willing to work in the private sector? And they won't sign off on something. You've got the decision trees. It takes 5 months in one of the local authorities we do, from recommending a contractor who's gone through procurement to actually awarding a contract. And they end up handing back money because they don't get through. It requires that cultural change and that leadership that's shown, it's been shown within Parliament and local authorities, but it's not filtering through. Similarly, that you're looking on the heat side of things, there are opportunities. If you look to see where the main manufacturer of heat pumps is in Livingston, we could be building heat pumps in Livingston rather than boilers from down south, which would be a big advantage. A lot of the skills that you need for gas boiler fitters are actually very similar to it. It's a few technical changes that are required, but they have got that basic skills that we've gone through. There's a need for consistency, whether it's making sure that building standards are going to change urgently, whether the programmes you've got, whether it's your Energy Efficient Scotland transition programmes, which are working with the self-funded markets in areas, which Jan mentioned, we've been notified that those are coming to, that we've got to review these, we've got to wait and fully evaluate, and we'll stop those programmes, even though you're building support, and maybe start them again in a year or two. We just have not got time to do that. There will be some mistakes made. We will have to become slightly less risk-averse if we're going to hit those targets. But it's vital we hit those targets, or what are we going to be saying to our children, that we're not achieving that? There will be that opportunity to do it.
Thank you. And Colin Beattie.
I think it was Professor Bell that clarified that the new gas boilers from 2025 would be for new builds only, which is fine, but as Fabrice Levesque said, that's only a certain number of houses every year. The big challenge is to retrofit the existing housing stock, and we've talked a lot about heat pumps here. Heat pumps are, in my opinion, and hopefully somebody will correct me, are unlikely to be the answer on an industrial scale across the country to replace existing heating systems. Most likely, as in European countries, they're more useful in rural and semi-rural areas. However, we've got to replace gas. What are we going to do to replace, on an industrial basis, the provision of gas to the vast bulk of our houses? Now, I know there's thoughts about things like hydrogen and so forth, but I'm unclear how far down the line we are with that. We can talk about heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, air source heat pumps. We can talk about biomass, where we import the pellets and so on from Scandinavia to be able to provide that biomass, which doesn't seem a brilliant idea to me. Where are we on actually tackling the big question, which is, how do we replace the gas supply? Is it feasible to switch across to hydrogen? How much would this cost? What would the impact on householders be? For example, for cooking and so on, can they use hydrogen? Is hydrogen only good for heating? Is it good for heating? Because I know there's certain issues around using hydrogen for safety and so on. So where are we on that?
Professor Bell.
I see you looking at me, so I think I should respond. And you're absolutely right. The big challenge is in the existing building stock, and it's not just homes. It's the whole stock, and much of that, as Fabrice said as well, is connected to the gas grid, and we've got to stop just unabated burning of methane. So you've hit the nail on the head there. Where are we? Well, there's some big uncertainties still. However, it's looking increasingly likely, I think, not just in the particular kind of scenario that the CCC has used to establish that, yes, the 2045 target in Scotland and 2050 for the UK of net zero does look credible and achievable. There are various ways in which that could be done in detail, but at least there seems that there's a pathway. But many of these scenarios do include hydrogen. It seems increasingly unlikely that we can do it without hydrogen, so maybe let's put it that way around. And the question then becomes, how much of it and how quickly do we get it in place? So there's a lot of discussion now, and this kind of, back to what Jan said about the need for evidence to build up, some of the safety issues around the use and in the usability, how it is actually you interact with it. Is it actually going to be useful for cooking, and do you know that the gas is lit and so on and so forth until you realise it's too hot? All those things have to be addressed, and there are projects going on to address that. Then establishing a market to get the hydrogen in the first place. So we have manufacturing of hydrogen at the moment, not in a low carbon way. There's a lot of talk now about building it up in these kind of industrial clusters, the centres where there already is a market for hydrogen for other purposes. The trick then is maybe seeing how that can be transitioned over time to being low carbon hydrogen. So it's very difficult to get it zero carbon. Steam methane reformation still has some emissions. So it's building up in kind of pieces, if you like. I think that seems to be how it goes. Establishing that, so you could have a blend of hydrogen into the existing gas networks, so I understand, up to about 20%. So you can envisage getting a market going there. To do that, the critical path in the short term seems to be the statutory rules set around safety and around billing as well, actually. So you touched on the other. Hydrogen doesn't have the same calorific value, if you like, as methane does. How do you measure that? How do you bill people in the right way? I don't know how long it's going to take to get those standards updated and written. We need to talk to someone from the Health and Safety Executive or something. Key question about the gas grid. It's a big thing. I was at a meeting yesterday, UK Energy Research Centre. That question came up as well. Some decision needs to be made, so that we're saying in the CCC, sort of around the mid-2020s, about what's happening there. This is just my own thinking on this, not necessarily a CCC line, but perhaps it's not enough to talk about the gas grid, but to look in more detail at the components of the gas grid. So there are differences in terms of how we might transition the transmission network from the distribution network. So a lot of the gas distribution network is already being replaced. So I understand it should be most of the replaced stuff is kind of hydrogen ready. So other people tell me it's not always true, but depends on how it's exactly done. So we have to look precisely what's already been done in that regard. Where is it? Where does it sit relative to the potential supplies of hydrogen? So there may be kind of different strategies in the different areas about what we do with the gas grid. And we have to think about the gas grids in different areas. So I don't have any answers, but there maybe are particular things we could kind of break down the question into other questions that are easier to answer in the shorter term.
Right, we'll take a brief follow-up point from Jackie Bailey and then see if Elizabeth Leighton, Euan McVicar or Professor Webb have answers.
Yeah, and it's a follow-up to Theresa Bray, because I think the thing the committee struggles with is it's very easy to declare a climate emergency. It's much harder to drive implementation. So you'll forgive us if we do question this in order to find the best way forward, because I'm not clear that somebody is coordinating all the different strands of this and has a clear idea of what we need to do. So, you know, that's why we're questioning so closely. Can I ask about fuel poverty, because that was something you spoke about? And it strikes me that the cost of these low carbon heating systems is very expensive at the moment. Hopefully the price will reduce. And we have two sectors in which we're dealing with. The kind of rented sector, whether it's socially rented or private sector renting, and homeowners. So what incentives do we need to have in place? One, that doesn't exacerbate fuel poverty, and two, that will increase the uptake amongst private sector landlords and homeowners. Is there a replacement for the renewable heat incentive or the low carbon infrastructure transition programme that you think needs to happen?
Well, perhaps. I don't know if Theresa Bray could have a think about that, because that's a slightly different subject. And I think Gordon MacDonald did have a quick follow-up to Professor Bell, and then I'll come to our three guests that I've mentioned, Elizabeth, Euan and Professor Webb. Gordon MacDonald.
In terms of replacing the gas central heating, I'm just wondering how viable electric heating is, given that Scotland's in a position where it regularly exports over 25% of the electricity generated to the rest of the UK. Is that not something that can be renewed? How efficient is electric storage heating, for instance, these days? And are there any incentives in place that would encourage homeowners to install some form of electric heating?
Elizabeth Leighton, do you want to come
yes.
back on all of these points?
Okay, I'll try to do that briefly. First about gas and dealing with decarbonisation of the gas grid. I just wanted to quote something from a CCC presentation, which I think kind of amplifies what Keith was saying about, and it's called Hydrogen Myth-Busting, because I think we would all desperately like to know that hydrogen is just going to seamlessly going to replace gas in the gas network, and we won't really have to change very much, and we'll hardly even notice it. But I don't think that's the case, and this is what this paper is saying, is that the sunk costs of the gas grid do not mean that economically it's a no-brainer to switch it over to hydrogen and use it to serve boilers as we do at the moment. There is not enough surplus low-carbon electricity to meaningfully contribute to hydrogen supply at scale, and I think that's what you were getting at of the components of the gas grid. There are components of the gas grid where it will be appropriate to use it, and particularly on the industrial process heat. But hydrogen, so therefore hydrogen is best used selectively alongside mass electrification. It is not a silver bullet. And so we have to accept that fact, you know, and start from that point and say, well, if that's the case, what do we know now that we need to do? So we need to, you know, of course, energy efficiency, as I've said before, fabric first, is going to apply in any case. And we know there's some figures that from a report commissioned by the CCC that we could avoid on a UK basis some 6.2 billion annual costs that it will cost more, 6.2 billion more, if we don't go down an energy efficient route. And we would also avoid electricity network investment costs for the UK of 4.3 billion. These are massive sums, and they will translate to costs to Scotland as well. So on gas energy efficiency, we've already mentioned the hybrid heat pump demonstrator projects or rollout. Those should be initiated as soon as possible. There's only one so far as I know, in the UK and Wales. And there's no reason why that shouldn't be replicated and built upon for Scotland, because we know that's what we need to do, as well as heat networks where appropriate, heat pumps where appropriate. Off gas, I wanted to also turn to, referred to as low regrets options. We know we have to switch off of high carbon fossil fuel heating systems, oil, coal, and LPG. So we should be doing that now. We should be signaling now that we should be phasing those out. We recommend from 2025, but with adequate support so that the vulnerable are not disadvantaged, with a replacement for the RHI so that the self-funded market are incentivized to take that up. And again, alongside energy efficiency improvements, because of course the heat pump will only work effectively if it's a highly insulated home. So there are things that we can do now with, as Teresa said, we have existing programs that could be built upon, low regrets in off-gas areas with appropriate support. Let's not leave the full fuel poor and rural areas behind in this low carbon transition. Let's make sure that everybody benefits from the transition.
Euan McVicar.
Thank you. I'd echo a number of these points. I think that it's clear there are a number of things that can be done now and quickly and easily, and those things ought to be done. But it's clear from the discussion that we've had, there are still a number of quite big choices that need to be made about the most effective and efficient ways to deliver decarbonisation of heat. And I think going back to Professor Webb's earlier point, we certainly be very supportive of making sure that action is taken now to gather together knowledge which shows which of those are going to be the most effective in terms of delivering decarbonisation, but also the lowest cost, so we can protect consumers and so we can protect particularly vulnerable consumers who are often those most badly affected by the cost of heat. So I think that getting anything that can be done now to gather strong evidence and knowledge around that is going to be hugely helpful and powerful for taking the big decisions that have to be taken. I just wanted to say a couple of things on hydrogen as well. I think it's right that hydrogen has a lot of potential, but there's a lot of further work that has to be done. In particular, there needs to be a legislative and regulatory framework that would support a greater rollout of hydrogen across the gas network. But there is potential there for decarbonisation. What we're doing in our price controls on the gas networks just now is encouraging network companies to build in needs-based investment cases for low-regret investment in getting the gas network prepared and ready for the rollout of hydrogen. And there's a lot of relatively low-cost, low-regret actions that could be taken by network companies to do that, and we'll be encouraging them to do that. And in the meantime, hopefully we can be building up an evidence base that helps us work out what is the right big picture path to take.
Thank you. And Professor Webb.
I would introduce the P word, as I think of it, into the discussion. Plans. It is an area which is crying out for a coordinated, systematic planning and development. And the evidence coheres around the argument that probably the solutions for low carbon heat, including the hydrogen question, will differ in different areas. And we use a lot of heating for buildings and hot water, of course, which you shouldn't forget in Scotland. So we do need to plan systematically in order to keep the costs down, apart from anything else, and also to move on with the necessary work to decide this. Now, our clear no regrets move is to encourage the reduction of the carbon content of gas in the gas grid by whatever measures are available, and I know that the current round of business planning for the next gas price control review is encouraging those moves, and I think that's a very valuable and important starting point. Asking about what will work in terms of hydrogen for heat. Obviously, I'm not an engineer, so I'm not answering from a technical perspective. But I do know from the policy analyses and modelling so far that that could be an expensive route to go down. It depends, because the calorific content, as Keith mentioned, is lower than methane gas. That could result in some rather difficult questions about tariffs and billing, particularly in relation to socially equitable distribution of costs. There are also, I think, some thorny questions for policymakers and politicians around if, for instance, we have a focused hydrogen demonstrator in a particular area around an industrial cluster, for instance, and then explore the use of that for heating all buildings in the nearby area. Should those costs be spread across the whole population of heat users, or should they be concentrated in one area? Because I think there are some politically challenging questions there about who pays for what, which we don't yet have clear answers to, and hence my planning question and request. The other area that balances this always, which we tend to forget because we haven't got very much of it, is the use of district heating networks. We waste an awful lot of heat, and we waste an awful lot of heat from industrial processes. We emit heat into the air and into rivers, into water. We could recover that heat by using large-scale heat pumps and building heat network infrastructure to pump the hot water around the system. But that, as Fabrice and others have alluded to, that only makes sense in areas where there is high heat demand and diversity of demand. Otherwise, you can't justify the capital infrastructure of that new network. But on the other hand, as I understand it, converting our existing gas grid to be fit for hydrogen, certainly if we're using steam methane reforming, is also a very high capital infrastructure proposal, probably higher than developing heat networks in areas where they make economic sense.
Right, I think perhaps go back to Theresa Bray before we move much further, and then Willie Coffey wanted to come in with a point.
Yep.
Theresa Bray, perhaps, if you recall at this stage what
I apologise if I appear to have been critical. In Scotland, we are in the position that we do have our average energy efficiency of our homes is higher in Scotland than the rest of the UK. Partly because we traditionally have built a lot of flats, we have high density housing, but also because of the government programmes we've had that we've continued that on, which has been good for improve the energy efficiency, but it's been very good for jobs as well, because you've been able to provide that continuity of employment. Because what you don't want to be doing is chopping and changing all the time, because you don't have that continuity. We've also been supported by, particularly in social housing, very clear targets set for social housing. Similar thing has got to happen with the private rented sector, because it's unfortunate that some of the poorest people do live in very poor quality housing, and it is just not fair on those people. And if you had regulation, that there was that expectation what's got to be happening, which has already been signalled that's going to be happening, that is going to. The majority of the properties that you've got to improve actually can be got there relatively easily, particularly amongst the tenement stock. Tenements are actually good in terms of energy efficiency compared to an awful lot of other housing because you're sharing so many walls. We're also in the position as well that we have a greater proportion that is off gas. And so that makes us think, how do we use the renewable heat incentive to actually support that transferring to low carbon heat? You do start looking at places like Orkney, where you've got a huge spare capacity in terms of generation. That we should be looking to see how can we make that generation so that it is one of the difficulties that the whole electricity pricing is not done to support electrical heating. We have got excess capacity that could be used. It's particularly that allows you to use the variability that with if you're using air source heat pumps or high heat retention storage heaters, they don't have to be on for every peak when everybody goes and makes a cup of tea after a particular TV programme. You don't have to have your heating on there, and if you start having much smarter things, it needs to be reflected in the price to those householders that that is managing their demand, that you're not just looking at battery storage that you're rewarding your householders in terms of aggregation. It can be one of the main ones, but we don't have a pricing mechanism that is reflected, that is actually reflecting those householders. We are doing pilots within Scotland to see how we can think of that. Which is challenging, but we've got to push, whether it's on Ofgem at a UK level, how do we make that spare capacity? And we will be looking at local energy systems, particularly in remoter areas where you can avoid your transmission and distribution costs by doing that. So there's the opportunity in the local energy systems, there's the need for regulation, and it does come back to the best way to, in terms of looking at your heat, is not to reuse it. Energy efficiency has got to be the prime area of activity, which we are working on and have got to continue on how we further develop those programmes. There's a range of things that we have got. Yes, it may not have all been brought together into a very clear plan about how we're working through, but part of the things, if you start looking at agile development, is now you try things out, you work, and you develop things that are successful, and you quickly ramp up. If we were to wait too long to have a plan, the gas network is a real challenge, but we could address everywhere that's off the gas starting immediately. There will be need for capital investment for it, that yes, we've got to think for the fuel poor that you will need to do that. How do you assist those owner-occupiers to take their, get their economies of scale? That is starting to happen in some of the energy efficient transition programmes. So we can see, like PV, where the prices just fall, they're likely to be similar developments for heat pumps. We've got to start building. If we wait too long to have a whole plan, on particularly gas network, we won't get there. But we can take other things. We've got that opportunity and control within Scotland.
Fabrice Levesque wanted to come in briefly on that point, and also Andy Whiteman, and then we'll come to Willie Coffey's question. Yeah.
Thanks. Jackie mentioned policy, which I'm keen to touch on, because I guess that's, for us, the most crucial thing, given that we represent companies that are trying to compete against fossil fuels, and that we need policies to level the playing field if we're to have a market. One of the most important pieces of potential Scottish Government policy is a heat networks bill that has been announced for this parliamentary year. Heat networks, as we've already discussed, have a very clear role to play. There's a broad agreement they are a low-regrets solution. We should be doing them now, and we have a supply chain that could do it. I think the heat networks bill will be a really good litmus test of whether the Scottish Government is actually serious about meeting the climate emergency. It's been at least 6 years in development, and it's an opportunity to, as well as regulate the sector, which is what we know will be in the bill, so measures to licence operators to enhance standards. It's also a chance to actually introduce legislation that helps grow the market, helps people deliver heat networks. We still don't know as an industry whether those measures that we've asked for will be within the bill. If they're not, it will be a huge missed opportunity. If we're not able to pull together a set of policies for a technology we do today that we have a clear case for, then frankly all the other things we've discussed I can't see happening anytime soon. So the Heat Networks Bill needs to have measures to address demand risk. So things like exclusive zones to make sure heat networks happen in the right place. We also need measures to compel buildings, if they're in the right place, if they're the right kind of building, to connect to the heat network. Only that will address the risks that currently prevent those markets from developing. That comes in addition to whatever replaces the RHI and the low carbon transition programme, LCITP, that you mentioned, because those policies are also needed alongside a heat networks bill, because they help either subsidise the low carbon inputs to help compete against the very low cost of gas, and they also help with the capital costs. So heat networks allow us to tap into heat in sewers and heat in rivers, but to get to that heat you need to build a bit of infrastructure to obviously extract the heat, abstract water, etc. So that's a bit of a plea around the policies that we need for the technologies we know we have to deliver today.
Thank you. And Andy Whiteman.
Thanks. I just want to pick up a point that Elizabeth Leighton made about getting demand down at the same time as decarbonising heat, and challenge Teresa's optimism. I mean, the EU directive on energy performance of buildings directive set a net zero target for energy of all public buildings by the end of 2018, and all new buildings by the end of 2020, and neither of those have been achieved. The Sullivan review, which was commissioned by the Scottish Building Standards Agency in 2007, recommended net zero carbon buildings by 2016-17. Obviously that's passed, not got that. The new building regs that just come out this year make absolutely no change at all in terms of CO2 reduction targets over the 2017 regulations. So the powers that we have to enforce higher standards in new buildings are just not being delivered. I don't. Why is that? Why, for example, are there no improvements over 2017?
Elizabeth Leighton.
Yes, I share your frustration. Something that we have called for is that there's no reason for us to go at the same pace with new build standards as the UK. We can move faster. We can build net zero homes today. There's no reason why we should be building homes that are reliant on the gas grid now. So I would urge that the building standards review that's taking place for 2021, these are standards that will come into play in 2021, would be more ambitious on also in terms of regulations for the existing stock. I think there was a missed opportunity, or at least I haven't seen it taken up, to bring in a trigger of regulation at point of major refurbishment. This is a time when people are already having disruption. They're already thinking of how can I improve my home. So it's a good opportunity and also a very economic one, where people could be encouraged and incentivized and ultimately a minimum standard set for improving their homes. So there are lots of levers that could be deployed in the building sector that we aren't seeing deployed. We've recently put out a report that I think was appended to our evidence, a pathway to zero carbon homes by 2045, and it builds on the CCC net zero report and puts it in a Scottish context and says, what are the policy levers that could deliver this change? And it will be a combination of regulation, incentives, grants for the vulnerable that all have to come together. Along with what Jan Webb was saying, we need better coordination. We need an oversight body that can be an independent oversight body and get on with the delivery. We simply need more, horsepower, if you will. We need more capacity to drive forward the Energy Efficient Scotland programme.
Professor Webb, and I'd like to bring Wally Coffey in because he's been waiting patiently to bring a question into the discussion. So, Professor Webb and then Wally Coffey.
Yeah. I was endorse what Elizabeth's saying, really, but I do not understand why we don't have higher building regulations in Scotland and why we're not requiring other, zero carbon standard now, effectively, for new build. When clearly the materials are there. We may not have the skills, but then skill development is surely an economic opportunity. The concern, as far as I'm aware, seems to be that setting higher standards chases developers away elsewhere where they can build cheaper or make better financial returns for the same output, as it were. But this seems to me in contradiction with the commitment to net zero and the statement signing up to recognising a climate emergency. So yes, I would want to see policy put in place, as Elizabeth is also saying, to make sure that we get there. Ideally last year, but certainly as fast as we possibly can. But more important, arguably, is the retrofit of our existing building stock. And we have the makings, I think, of a very powerful policy framework in the Energy Efficient Scotland programme. But what we've seen in evaluating the pilots is just how slow those developments are and how challenging it is in the current resourcing and management model and coordination model to move ahead faster, more coherently on an area basis. And I think the area basis is very important, reducing the need for heating, space heating in all of our building stock, including all of our public estate, which can lead by example, can show the kinds of standards that can be met and so on. And again, we tend to stumble over how is this going to be made affordable. Well, if we can't make this affordable, then we are not going to respond to the climate emergency that we've declared. It makes absolute sense as we all know. I mean, I think it's not at all contentious, but we still don't seem to have the commitment to resourcing it properly or the timetable behind it, and that includes, I would say, local authorities who are not necessarily able to. I think it was Teresa gave the example of just how long the procurement process takes. We've seen buildings, just single buildings in the pilots for Energy Efficient Scotland, take an awful long time to get upgraded because they are multi-occupancy buildings, multi-ownership and often multi-use buildings. And we need to, I would say, regulate to get over those difficulties of collaboration and coordination in multi-occupancy buildings and across our building stock. Better stop.
Wally Coffey, then I'll bring a couple of our guests in who have been wanting to contribute.
Thanks very much, Convener. I just wanted to invite the panel to give us a little glimpse of what's happening in Europe. Some of the information we have in front of us suggests that the percentage share of energy consumption attributable to renewable heat is much higher across the European Union than it is in the UK and indeed in Scotland. In fact, it's about 19% in the European Union compared to about 7% and 6% UK and Scotland. Could any of the panellists give us some kind of idea why that is the case and what kind of lessons we might learn to try to bridge that gap?
So why are they perhaps better at delivering some of these things in European countries than we are? Is it just down to planning, or what about actually executing the plans and delivering what we plan? First of all, Anthony Kyriakides and then Professor Bell.
I was just going to just add to some of the previous conversations, and there's been a lot of discussion about what is it that government can do, what is it that the industry can do, and I think as we're seeing with lots of the climate strikes that are going on, I think there's an empowerment of the population that's also required. So most people wouldn't even know what sort of renewable heating systems options are available for their home, and the Scottish Government does have services through Home Energy Scotland to help raise awareness, but the scale of change needs to change drastically. And people need to be demanding that they live in a home that's more energy efficient and that is low carbon. And that's not on people's radar at all. So we would support anything that would help raise awareness at a national scale to make people aware of the fact that change is coming, is already happening and is coming, that they are empowered with the information that they would need to make those decisions, whether they're needing to make a decision now or whether they're thinking 5 years' time, I need to change my system. And that will then also give signals to industry that there's a demand for them to move into these sorts of areas and to develop the supply chain accordingly, because that's what they will respond to, as well as policy drivers.
Sir Bell.
Yeah, thanks. There's a bunch of things that come up we ought to try and tie together, I think. So there's a couple of questions. I think Donna raised a question a while ago about electric heat, and it's kind of a bit related to, I think, what Willie Coffey's just been asking. So I think in much of Europe there's a lot of electric heat already. Yeah. And so you look at places like, France or Scandinavia. In Denmark, there's actually got a lot of district heating, but there's a lot of renewable electricity generation, a lot of wind. In Norway, there's a lot of hydropower. That's already low carbon. In France, they have a lot of nuclear power. So there's a lot of electric heat in France. They've got a big question about what they do when the existing nuclear power stations are closed. What are they going to replace them with? So I think that's a large part of the answer about how it's different in Europe. Exactly what kind of heating, and whether it's storage heaters or whatever, and whether it's more efficient than we have here. I know electric storage heaters are pretty notorious as not working very well. And that's something that, in theory, if especially we mentioned prioritising sort of more rural areas, especially because the heat pumps should be, arguably more effective. There's still some things to do. I do hear people talking about heat pumps as somehow not working as well in our damper climate than in other places, say, and even in Scandinavia. So that's something I'm not sure about. I'm a little bit worried about, as to do with really the effectiveness here and what the manufacturers can do about it. question about where the electricity comes from. So I mentioned, in the French or the Norwegian context, that's a big answer to the question of why there's so much electric heat. We are doing very well developing renewable electricity generation here. It means fantastic reductions in the cost. In the last round of auctions for contracts for difference, for offshore and for island renewables, astonishing, really, coming in at sort of around about £40 a megawatt hour, relative to what we were expecting even 5 years ago, is amazing. And you can imagine what the costs might be. I've been talking to one or two people suggesting that onshore renewables would now be quite a bit lower than that. Is there a need for a contractual framework to underpin it? I would suggest that there is. There's still a challenge for getting the long enough term, enough of the energy bought ahead of time to give you confidence in the investment, which suggests a CFD-like arrangement for onshore wind, which is not a subsidy, it's just providing a contractual confidence base, if you like. But nevertheless, there are people trying to develop it on a commercial basis. So there's a variability, of course, to renewables. So this is, I think, a big thing, even we have to acknowledge it in the CCC Net Zero report, looking out to 2040, or that sort of decade, how to manage that variability. We do talk there, a credible scenario is what we call mid-merit generation that is dispatchable and schedulable, can ramp up and down to fill in the gaps. Would have to be low carbon, might need to burn hydrogen that's been manufactured in a reasonably low carbon way. So that's not that far away, the 2040s. And given the kind of lifetime of the gas turbines, that's something we've got to address quite seriously in sufficient time. More interconnectors would help to manage the variability as well. When we've got a surplus, our neighbours have got some spare. Imagine connections to Norway that can save the water and sell it to us. And we sell them the surplus wind and they can save the water. So there's mutual benefits. Slight hold-ups, I think. One or two projects are now on a bit of on hold due to uncertainty around Brexit, but hopefully we can get over that and get some more certainty back in there. So hopefully that picks up some of those questions. I think the thing that's coming up a lot, and we haven't really kind of tackled, is the cost. So our best estimates at the moment is these measures, whether it's energy efficiency or heat pumps or whatever, are more expensive at the moment than the gas supply. By the way, another reason why we're in the position where we are is because we have so much of our heat, as others have said, Fabrice and Co. 80% of homes are on gas. I think the only other country in Europe that's kind of got as much as us is maybe the Netherlands. So it'd be interesting to look to them to see what they're doing as well. So 1 to 2% of GDP is the CCC's estimate of how much getting to net zero would cost over that period out to 2045, 2050. Doesn't sound like a hell of a lot, put it in those terms, but it is still, we have to admit, it's a significant cost. Now there are, two things that maybe we have to think about. One is how much the costs are going to come down of the different technologies. Hybrid heat pumps, I would expect they should come down. There's not a big market at the moment. Existing kind of conventional heat pumps, I don't know, hopefully they'll come down. The cost of installation should come down. A lot of the technologies to do with hydrogen, we're making kind of best estimates at the moment. They may well become much cheaper. We're hoping we can see some similar trends as we've seen with wind generation. The big question then is how do we recover those costs? On whom do those costs fall and in what ways? And this is really, I think, one of the biggest policy questions. We can't deny that there are costs, but how do we split them? We have to do it. The climate emergency is real. Do they fall on the individual consumers on the basis of the kilowatt hours that they consume? Do we somehow socialise? We talked about grants. How do you pay for those grants? On what basis do you form them? Is it grants or combination of grants and loans towards a capital cost? Are they recovered perhaps from levies on other sectors to give an incentive on them? There's sticks and carrots an approach that can be used. So, I think those are some of the major questions is where do the costs fall? What instruments do you have as policymakers, either here or at a UK level?
I think John Mason, did you want to come in on some aspect, and also Jamie
Well,
Halker?
I think what I was going to ask has been covered, but I think that I'd just like to follow up on just some of the points that have been made just now about the costs. There's the cost of the actual infrastructure and so on, and the running costs, but in the area of like rates, business rates, non-domestic rates, and the way different infrastructure is treated, are we in a fair place at the moment, or is there movement needed in that area?
That's not something I would count myself as being expert on, but I would look to other panellists who want to come in on that.
In terms of heat networks, absolutely not. So that's one of the key issues for that sector, is that the way you calculate business rates for a heat network varies compared to if you're comparing just an individual gas boiler in a building. So it can be twice as much, if not more. So if a customer is looking at a heat network option or just a standard gas boiler for a large commercial building or several, the business rates bill will be prohibitive to the point that it's actually stopping a lot of potential heat network projects from moving forward. So yeah, I'm glad it's been raised, because that's one of the key issues. The Scottish Government currently applies a 50% discount on the business rates for heat networks, but that has to be renewed every year by the Parliament, so it doesn't give any visibility to these kind of large projects which take several years to complete. So it's stopping a lot of projects from happening.
And I mean, if I can also make just a kind of more general point. I mean, Professor Webb talked about, the need for plans, and I'm still a bit unclear in my head as to whether, I mean, there's clearly an urgency, but I mean, do we need a city like Glasgow to say, right, we're going down the electric route, we'll just make all our houses, everything will be electric, and Edinburgh goes down a different route? I mean, is it, or can we just leave it to, well, in Glasgow, the university is going to do a district heating system, but somebody else is going to do biomass, and somebody else is going to do electric if it's a multi-storey? I mean, are we needing to plan in more detail in these kind of areas and actually dictate to people, owners?
Professor Webb, did you want to?
When I was referring to planning, we have the beginnings of a framework in place through Energy Efficient Scotland in the proposal to introduce local heat and energy efficiency strategy creation as a statutory duty or a statutory power for local authorities. And the idea behind that proposal to introduce that requirement is that the local authority, in coordination, cross-sector coordination, as well as multi-level, so it would need to be done obviously in collaboration with government, with Scottish Government, as well as wider interests, and on the commercial side, the energy utilities. But for instance, in Glasgow, one would expect to see a strategy and an implementation plan that said, okay, this area is zoned, as Fabrice referred to as well, for district heating development. We've already got something of that in place in a city like Glasgow to build on. This area is likely to be electrification of heat, perhaps air source heat pumps, perhaps some other electrification solution. This area may be, I don't know, gas hybrid heat pumps in the first instance, but this area may be a trial run for a hydrogen network. So, but actually looking properly in detail at the current potentials in some areas, I think Teresa referred to Orkney, there is actually a surplus of electricity production relative to current demand, so there's opportunity to do rather different sorts of experiments there. Orkney at present is part of the demonstrators for the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, prospering from the energy revolution, so a lot of long terminology here, but basically Orkney is trying to test the potential for energy efficient solutions by integrating across heat, power, transport, storage, and using digital technologies to manage that.
Final point, I mean, would it be, so when should we make that decision? When should Glasgow or Orkney make that decision? This is the way we're going. Should that be this year they make that decision, or 2025, or?
We need to be starting it now, I would argue, yes. I mean, that is in train through the proposals for Energy Efficient Scotland. What we should not do, I think, is sit back and think, oh, well, when should we start that? So we've got some pilot developments through the energy efficient pilot programs that have looked at local heat and energy efficiency strategy, including in the city of Glasgow. But what we don't have is the means at present, and I would say the resourcing critically behind those, to make them comprehensive and to develop the implementation behind them. So what local authorities in our interviews with them are saying back to us is, Well, this tells us some things, but mostly what we already know. We need to go further, needs to be more comprehensive. We need better data. We need to make sure that we plan on the basis of the eventual performance of those replacement systems, whether it's hydrogen or whether it's district heating networks or whether it's electrification, because we know that at present we're not meeting the standards that we're setting ourselves. In practice, there is that gap between the standard and the actual delivery, and that's a big skills and training programme.
Okay, so a year basically, right?
So
okay.
Start now. Start. Yeah.
Mentioning Orkney, Jamie Halker-Johnson, did you want to come in on some of these points?
I did. As an Orcadian, I'm always delighted to hear Orkney's success being highlighted. I wanted, I'll come on to kind of that, but I just wanted to, in general, and I think you've kind of hinted on it, but in general, the kind of, I suppose, how you feel, or how people here feel the success of the local heat and energy efficiency strategies has been, what is being learned from that, and also slightly wider from that, planning has obviously been mentioned as an issue. What barriers there are within the planning system to heat networks, whether there should be kind of exclusions for them, should they be considered permitted developments, that sort of thing. I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts on that.
Fabrice Levick.
On the local heat and energy efficiency strategies, I think just to go back slightly to Jan's point as well, it's really important that these provide a kind of clarity about what the future options are, but as we've heard today, there's a lot of uncertainty around what the solutions will be. But where there is less uncertainty, we actually need those strategies to have implementation to lead into policy. So I would flag that if they're to be more than just desktop studies, those local strategies need to have some policy attached to them. The obvious candidate being, again, heat networks, because we know we need to roll those out. We have areas of our large cities where they are suitable. So we would like to see in the heat networks bill or some other mechanism to provide exclusive zones to developers, whether they are public or private sector, and those zones to be clearly identified in the LHEs. And if you speak to local authorities, I think for them as well, they've done lots of studies, they've done lots of analysis. For them, these studies only really come alive if there is some policy attached to them. So if the Scottish Government can start to join up the various bits it's doing, and this would be the ideal candidate, we might then start to see a bit more follow through in terms of other policy areas. And that leads us to planning, because the local strategies can also show where new build developments are suitable for heat networks. And again, there needs to be a link from the local strategy into a local development plan. An easy thing for the Scottish Government to do, there's a review of the NPF and SPP coming up. We'll be feeding into that, but at the moment we're not seeing joined up thinking. The local heat and energy efficiency strategies remain mostly desktop exercises, and yes, it's important we get those right, but we mustn't lose sight that ultimately the aim of those strategies is to implement change and have some policy.
Sorry, just when you talk about there's a lack of joined up thinking, is that perhaps because there are different voices coming in with different opinions, or is there is there a kind of consensus within the sector that this is what needs to be done?
I think, frankly, it's partly because of the resource that Scottish Government has at its disposal to work on this policy area. It's been 3 years in the current period that we've been developing these strategies. The staff have changed at Scottish Government. It's a difficult area, as you've probably gleaned from today's discussion. They need to resource it better, both in central government but at a local authority level. There is a lot of consensus. It's just it needs some leadership and it needs a clear goal at the end of it. We've kind of enthusiasm for this within Scottish Government has waxed and waned. I hope that one of the benefits of declaring a climate emergency is once and for all, this can be made a priority and we can get on and do it, because it has, as I say, interest in this has fluctuated.
And I think Elizabeth Leighton and Anthony Kyriakidis, did you want to come in on this as well, or?
On this point, actually, I sort of raised my hand a little bit earlier. It was a point that John Mason raised about taxes and
no,
yeah, it's just a point to add about VAT. In that recently, HMRC has made a change to the VAT that is applied to energy-saving materials. So that's things like insulation as well as renewable systems. And that was that they had to do that. I believe they challenged it, but they had to do that under EU diktat. And that's just only served to increase the cost of these systems. So before, if you were retrofitting a heat pump, a biomass boiler, something like that, insulation, you could the VAT rate was at 5%, and now it's gone up to 20%. So it's just to emphasise the fact that there actually needs to be something that Scotland has control of, that they can say, okay, well, this is how we're going to try and address some of these changes that are actually making it harder for people to afford things rather than easier.
Right, Elizabeth Leighton, you.
Yeah, I wanted to come back on the question about Europe and then about costs. And on Europe, I thought it would be useful to look at those European countries like the Netherlands that are in more of a similar situation to us with a big reliance on gas. And in the Netherlands, they have taken a decision that they are going to fully decarbonize away from the gas grid. They're going to disconnect communities from the gas grid and replace their heating with low carbon heating systems, be they heat networks or heat pumps. And, you know, for example, they've made a commitment that 1.5 million homes are going to be disconnected from the gas grid by 2030. And then that will inform how they do the rest of them. And that, you know, that's all building. So it's a huge commitment. We can learn from how they've approached it. And another case, Ireland, they've already decided to ban new oil boilers from 2022 and new gas boilers in new homes from 2025. So we're hardly at the cutting edge here. You know, there are other and there's a long list of other countries that have also made, you know, big commitments in that direction, where we could be showing more leadership. On the issue of cost, I mean, there's no getting around it that this is going to cost a lot to decarbonize our buildings, yet at the same time, we know that they're absolutely central to achieving that decarbonization objective. And as I said earlier, that if you take a macroeconomic point of view, it is the least cost pathway to do so. If we don't do it this way, if we don't spend this money, it's going to cost more to do it some other way. And so I think, you know, we have to own up to that and say, well, yes, for the public good, there's good cause to subsidize or incentivize and to spend public infrastructure spend or revenue spend to support this. And in some cases, we'll be able to do this not with new money, but by repurposing existing programs. You know, just a very small example, the Warmer Homes Scotland program, the fuel poverty program, they are now funding fossil fuel heating boilers. Should we be doing that? You know, why are we doing that when we know that we want to go in the other direction? And we can also look at the investment in terms of that the capital costs may be high, but the running costs are not high. And so we actually can solve the problem of fuel poverty and all the ensuing costs that those bring, not just to individual lives, but to Scottish society, by making that helping with that upfront investment. So I think, you know, our call has been that the budget for just the domestic side on the energy efficiency agenda has to be double what it is now. We had a commitment in 2015, that's 4 years ago now, that energy efficiency of building was going to be an infrastructure priority. And yet the budget flatlined. You know, if this is really an infrastructure priority, we should be seeing a budget climbing and rising steadily to meet new targets for fuel poverty and climate change. So we've called for a budget of 240 million annual and rising to meet these targets. And I'd encourage the community, the committee, to scrutinize, you know, in your pre-budget scrutiny of the budget, to look at the figures in terms of what you've heard today, but also to explore what is happening with the heat decarbonization plan that is due out this summer, again, in light of the evidence that you have heard today.
Theresa Bray, and then a question from committee member Dean Lockhart.
I'm responding to the local heat and energy efficiency strategies. They have been done at a variety of levels, sort of at a whole local authority level, looking at Glasgow, but Change was particularly involved in taking a much smaller area, taking Peebles and surrounding area, and you start looking at in detail to see what you can actually practically do in terms of low heat and energy efficiency. Some of them are longer term ones, thinking about waste heat in the water network, but it's also identifying we've got to the level of there's a fair number of new build properties, approximately 10 to 15 years old in West Linton, that are put in with originally oil boilers because it's off the gas network. They are now looking to replace their boilers. They're coming to the end of that things, and we are specifically, as part of the delivery mechanism of an Energy Efficient Scotland transition programme, we are looking to see self-funding of air source heat pumps, because they have got to that stage of replacing. But it does, you really need to go down into that detail to see where is that opportunity, where do you take advantage of this? And this is not with grant funding. These are often, okay, it's a commuter belt to Edinburgh often, but there's a real opportunity there. But there is a need for that support from the Energy Efficient Scotland transition programmes and from Home Energy Scotland for people to take that step change. And they are looking to invest, and you will get economies of scale. If you start putting in 20 or 30 air source heat pumps in an estate, you'll have contractors working there, you'll be able to get some bulk purchase, it will make a difference. But there is that need for support there. I think that's one of the things with these the strategies. It's going to take time to develop them. You are going to both have a local authority-wide one for your heat networks, but you're also having to go down to that granular approach for looking at both energy efficiency and particularly where you've got off gas.
Jamie Harcourt-Johnson and Dean Lockhart.
Yeah, it's a point that's come up a number of times, and it's something that's been spoken to me in Orkney and Shetland, both of areas obviously of high fuel poverty. The lack of awareness of the opportunities out there. So, you know, how do we increase awareness of the opportunities, the opportunities to get involved with air source heat pumps or whatever it happens to be, better insulation? How do we increase that? Are there too many different initiatives, too many different voices? Should there be one organisation really pushing it, or I suppose what's the approach that needs to be taken?
I think that it's quite interesting comparing what happens in Shetland and what happens in Orkney, because they have they're different communities. Yeah. In Shetland, it's very much controlled by the local authority. In Orkney, because there are a lot of demonstrator projects, there's a wider range of things, and there are local organisations coming involved. Home Energy Scotland has got much more of that things. And I think that part of that is that openness to actually, local authorities do have a key role, but they cannot deliver everything. They need to have support to deliver there. They need, whether it's technical expertise to help them on that way, but also to actually increase their horizons of what can be achieved. There's huge potential, particularly in the islands, for looking at off gas. In Shetland, you could take, they have got district heating. It's got one of the largest district heating in Scotland, but it's burning plastics from the oil and gas installations. That has got to be changed. You've already got your infrastructure there. How are you going to repurpose that? Thinking, how can you combine what's happening with SE? So you need to have that bigger picture. So it's how do we rise those the horizons about what can be achieved? I don't think you can say there's a single point that sorts all problems. An oversight body can look to support both the local authorities and different community approaches to actually work with different things. There is such a variety taking place that if we cannot, right solution for Shetland is not the same as the right solution for Glasgow. But there are a lot of common practices amongst, whether it's the technical approaches about how you combine with the district network operators, how can you do that, that can be supported to actually achieve that.
Thank you, Convener. It was actually looking at the future of the energy sector in Scotland and how it may evolve over the next couple of years, because we have new agencies being established that will have an impact on the energy sector. The Scottish National Investment Bank has its overriding mission to deal with the climate emergency. There is also plans to establish a publicly owned energy company to reduce fuel poverty. Both agencies may be established over the next 12 to 18 months. How do you see them getting involved in tackling the climate emergency and helping to address the Scottish Government targets?
Well, I'll come to Fabrice Levesque first.
I'll briefly just touch on the past questions. A very simple suggestion in terms of how do we advertise the change to consumers, to householders. The Energy Efficient Scotland programme should lead to a specific kind of Scottish household assessment. So you'll a bit like an energy performance certificate assessment, but a bit more detailed. And we haven't seen any evidence yet that will focus on anything other than fabric efficiency. That's really important, but if we're actually going to hit the timelines that we have, any communication to householders needs to talk to people about their current boiler and what it needs to look like in the future. So whether that's telling you that you're in a heat network zone, or perhaps you're off the gas grid and that your oil and LPG has to change, that would be a relatively simple change and tweak that should arguably be happening now. And just on the question about the agencies, the Scottish National Investment Bank, one of the things we've been exploring is whether that could provide a larger amount of low-cost capital to local authorities trying to deliver heat networks. Whilst they do have access to things like the Public Works Loan Board, in reality, that's quite closely guarded by other bits of a local authority. So we'd certainly like to see SNIB investigate whether it has a role to provide a much bigger pool of funding, because as with all renewables, there's a lot of upfront capital cost. Whatever you can do to reduce that capital cost goes a long way to making the technology cheaper. If we look at offshore wind, some of the biggest cost reductions of the last few auctions have been because they've had access to much cheaper finance because it's been seen as lower risk. So that's one suggestion.
Thank you. I think we're probably coming towards the end of our time now, so perhaps we'll give our guests the last word, as it were, each of you something to contribute on these last few points we've been discussing. So perhaps just go around the table, Theresa Bray and then Anthony and so on.
I think very much so that there is the need to ensure that there is the policy framework there, that the funding follows through. Yes, for the particularly sort of Elizabeth already rated the need for supporting energy efficient Scotland, so that following through on the commitment. We need to ensure that there's continuity where we learn incrementally and not chopping and changing. We continue with our energy efficient Scotland transition pilots, but we also start planning ahead for the needs for heat networks as well. I am positive, though, and I might say I've been too positive. I think we can, as Scotland, we led in the Industrial Revolution, we can lead in the low-carbon revolution as well. And I think that by committing sort of the policy framework, the delivery, and examining what the hurdles are, we can achieve that to the benefit of everybody. It will be some challenges, but I'm sure that we will achieve it.
All right. Anthony.
Thank you. There are about 600,000 homes that are off the gas grid, and I think that presents a perfect opportunity to develop a supply chain for low carbon heating systems at a mass scale over the coming 5 years, and signalling that traditional fossil fueled heating systems are going to be, you won't be able to install them after a certain point, and suggesting by the mid-20s will drive that. You bring economies of scale in, you drive down prices, the supply chain will ramp up, and we believe that's a perfect way of then leading into the following 5 years after that. Whether we have hydrogen decisions or not, I think that puts us in a really good position, and making people aware of what their options are through the supply chain and through other mechanisms will also help to drive the change that's required.
Thank you. Professor Webb.
Well, just responding to the question about National Investment Bank and the publicly owned energy company proposals, I think it's critical that the bank is at the heart of low carbon infrastructure development across the energy sphere, as well as our building stock, which I would count as a critical low carbon infrastructure. So it has to be involved in the retrofitting programme. I would hope that it emulates the best practices of infrastructure banks publicly owned in other places, such as the German example. We've seen how progressive that is indeed in encouraging renewable heat in Germany, for instance, in the development of infrastructure through low-cost loans, through blended finance, through a number of financial instruments there. So I think it has to play a critical role in enabling and speeding up that process. And I would hope, similarly, drawing on some comparative work we've done with German cities, that a publicly owned energy company would be at least as effective as some of the German Stadtwerke, the big municipal enterprises, which have been able to build on economies of scale from operating across waste, water, local energy systems and so on, to again capitalise on what you can do if you bring all the pieces together. Thank you.
Euan McVicar.
I'd very much agree about looking at the German example when it comes to what the Scottish National Investment Bank might do. I think there's lots of models that KfW have implemented that would allow customers and consumers to be able to help fund their own investment in infrastructure that they'll need. I think that's an interesting model to follow. One point on the local strategy documents, I think that there's a lot that could be done there to assess what is the most effective solution in particular circumstances and to get a good evidence base to be drawn up across a particular area. And that will feed into the national discussion that needs to take place on what is the most effective route for decarbonisation. And I think we always have to come back to looking at what is going to deliver the best, the highest impact here on decarbonisation for heat, because the consequences of how we heat our homes and our industries is so huge for the question. So finding the best and most effective way of answering that question is something that needs as much evidence and data as possible just now.
Thank you, Professor Bell.
Yeah, I think the local energy plans, but really important, as others have said, identifying the right solution in the right places. There seem to be, I think, from the discussion and the discussions at other times, three main obstacles. One that Jan mentioned, the resourcing, the local authorities being tooled up, really, in terms of their capability. The second thing is data. Do they know really what the circumstances are so they can be confident about a decision that they make or might make? And the third one that Fabrice has mentioned and Jan touched on as well, about access to finance. So to echo what others have said, the Scottish National Investment Bank seems to represent a really, really important opportunity in that respect, but we still need to address the kind of the tooling up of the local authorities and access to data and the knowledge. So they can have confidence to then get on with it. This is what we've been saying quite a lot, is, where we can see Anthony's point about, off-gas heating is a really important one. One thing we haven't mentioned, in terms of the cost, there's some benefits. There's the co-benefits, actually, in terms of comfort in homes and the health benefits that come along with that. There's a bit of a nervousness, perhaps, about the use of biomass, where there's some, some of the emissions there. So don't be too hung up on biomass, I would say. But if people are out of fuel poverty and have got a heating system that works, then their health should be a lot better as well. The energy company, I think we need to be clear, or I'd like to think the Scottish Government would be clear about what it's really doing. The idea that it can somehow set up and be a supplier that is then somehow going to be much cheaper than the existing market, I don't see any evidence for that being the case. The 2 or 3 companies that have been set up on that basis have really struggled. We've seen lots of new entrant suppliers have gone bust over the last year. But I think the sort of thing that Euan mentioned and that Jan mentioned about that this company can help to underpin capital investment and help to identify and maybe fill in the gap in terms of the capability that the local authority has, then that seems to represent a really important opportunity. And the last wee point I'll make, who do you get the message out to? Yes, we need to somehow inform householders, but the installers are the best people to talk to. I'll give you just one little example. My gas boiler gave up recently and it was condemned. So I had to make a quick decision about what to do about it to get some heat in my own home. Spoke to my normal plumber, and he spoke to his mate, the gas fitter, talked to them about a hybrid air source heat pump solution. No, I don't know anything about that. Can't help you. So luckily, I knew a few other people I could talk to. So, I asked around a little bit, but, if they can come back and say, yes, this is how you do it, this is what it's going to cost you, okay, it's going to cost you a lot, but maybe you could get a loan or you can get a grant or whatever, I'd have been much more likely to go for it. So I had to just go for the immediate solution of a new gas boiler, and people have told me I can retrofit a heat pump. So watch this space, whether I actually go for it or not.
Finally, Elizabeth Leighton.
Yes, I can only echo the highlights or the really key points I'd like to leave you with is, I think where I started was it's not just about renewable heat generation, it's about the demand. I think it's been covered very thoroughly, and that should appear in future heat policies and in a refreshed climate change plan. Budget, clearly more investment is going to be required, investment but also capacity to deliver the program, and we'd recommend an independent body is set up to do that. And lastly, we are in an incredibly rare moment of opportunity where I think the public is with us. The public want these climate-friendly homes. They want a warm home. They've heard about it, and they're hearing about it from their neighbors. And so the momentum is with us, and we need to ride it. We need to, make the most of that and have a really positive and engaging campaign, as Anthony had mentioned, that is going to help people along the way so that they can do their part to contribute to this, and they're given a helping hand to make their contribution to decarbonising our homes.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to all of our guests for coming in today, and that completes this item on the agenda, so we'll move into private session.